Thank you very much, Aaron. So I'll be speaking today about one concrete case study that appears particularly suitable, I think, when thinking about the connection between medieval studies and Ethiopian studies, namely the Solomonic Ethiopian diplomatic missions to Latin Europe in the 15th and early 16th century, and what they reveal about Ethiopian kingship of the time. In fact, the result of my decade-long research on the subject is quite the opposite of what is commonly assumed in both medieval and Ethiopian studies. I think it opens up new perspectives not only on the unique cultural history of the Ethiopian Christian kingdom of the 15th and early 16th century, but it also sheds new and rather different light onto African-European encounters on what is still often called the European Age of Exploration. But let's start from the beginning. In the latter half of the 14th century, the consolidation of Solomonic Christian power over most of the central Northeast African highland realm had ushered in substantial religious reform, as well as the local translation and flourishing of religious literature. As the research of Marie-Laure Derat has shown, the 15th and early 16th century in particular witnessed a period of monumental royal building activity in the central Ethiopian highland plateau. We find the construction of dozens of prestigious royal churches and monasteries, which were a material testament to the Solomonic king's supreme claim to political power and a physical assertion of each sovereign's rightful and just Christian rulership. Such royal religious centers naturally not only had to be built and ornamented, they also had to be endowed and furnished with precious books, ecclesiastical garments, fine fabrics, liturgical utensils, relics, and also icons. I would argue that we need to read the concurrent diplomatic relations between Solomonic Ethiopia and the Latin West against the backdrop of this royal agenda of building important religious centers. Between 1400 and the late 1520s, Ethiopian kings sent numerous diplomatic missions to different places in Latin Europe. Depending on how we count, their number varies, but at the very least, we find a dozen embassies sent out from Ethiopia. The vast majority of embassies were dispatched within the first half of the 15th century. Here, Solomonic envoys arrived at places as varied as Venice, Rome, Valencia, Naples, and Lisbon. Ethiopian pilgrims, sometimes cast as inadvertent ambassadors, are likewise attested from Lake Constance in modern-day Germany to Santiago de Compostela in the very west of the Iberian Peninsula. Indeed, nearly all rulers and regions of the 15th and early 16th century sent out envoys to Latin Europe in some way or another, which leads to the question, why did Ethiopian rulers send out their emissaries in the 15th and early 16th century? Historians and philologists of Europe and Ethiopia have studied these diplomatic encounters for more than a century. They noted an Ethiopian interest in craftsmen and occasionally relics. In 1967, historian Renato Lefebvre suggested that Solomonic rulers dispatched their missions out of a desire to obtain masters of art and industry to raise the Ethiopian kingdom's civil and technical level and to enhance its military efficiency. In his groundbreaking work on medieval Solomonic history of 1972, historian Tadesse Tamrat largely followed Lefebvre's interpretation. He too assumed that the delegation's purpose had been to ask for artisan technologists, military experts, and access to European technology. Both scholars' views have significantly impacted the field. Between the 1980s and now, scholarship largely and uniformly asserts that Solomonic missions to Europe were tied to a desire to obtain craftsmen technologists, a need for European technology and arms, and a desire for military alliances with the Christian powers of the Western Mediterranean. Now, this might be quite true for later periods, including the early 16th century and the 19th century, when Atzoteodros indeed openly asked for gunsmiths from Europe. It is, however, not true for the 15th century. All of the above, the arms, the craftsmen technologists, the military matters, are absent in the available sources for the first 100 years of Solomonic diplomatic outreach. What we find instead in the sources is largely the following. In 1402, at Sir Dawood's first embassy arrived in Venice, Latin sources attest that upon the request of the Ethiopian ambassador, a painter, a builder, a tile and brickmaker, a carpenter and a swordsmith were sent out from Ethiopia by the Venetian authorities. Moreover, Arabic and Goes texts assert that the embassy arrived back in the Highland Kingdom with 2 relics and a whole host of ecclesiastical fabric and liturgical items. They came back with chalices, censers, bowls and pitchers, embroidered vestments, robes, tunics and mitres. 25 years later, Dawood's son Yeshak sent an embassy to Aragon. We know from Aragonese sources that 13 master craftsmen in a variety of skills were sent out to Ethiopia. Embroidered liturgical vestments were found with the ambassadorial group on their way back. Also in their possession, according to new important Arabic source evidence recently uncovered by Julien Lezeau, were 2 golden church bells, plus a letter by the Ethiopian king ostensibly requesting a specific relic, namely a nail of the Passion, as well as items of goldsmithery, crosses and bells. Ooh. Yet another 25 years later, Tsar Jakob sent another embassy to Aragon. Again sent out were masters and artisans. One Latin source specifies that the craftsmen furnished Ethiopia with the arts they gave, indicating again builders and ornamenters rather than technologists. Also requested and sent out was a reliquary box, brocade fabrics, finest woolen cloths, vessels of gold and silver. In the 1520s, Dawood's great-great-grandson, Lipnadingle, would similarly request the dispatch of painters, sculptors, stonemasons, carpenters, gold and silversmiths, bookmakers, gold leaf specialists, engravers, metalworkers, roofers, architects, glassblowers, and tile makers from Portugal and the papacy. He also asked for rugs and large-scale embroidered curtains for churches and statues of the Virgin and the saints. True, Lipnadingle also asked for miners, physicians, and gunsmiths, as well as swords and every sort of weapon of war, but these were requests within a very long list of other demands, and incidentally were only found in the Portuguese and Latin version of his letters and not in the Ge'ez. So what we find here is an interesting discrepancy between scholarship opinion and source evidence. The currently available sources show that arms, European technology, and military alliances only appear in the 16th century. And even then, they are just part of a much larger list of Solomonic interests and desires. Throughout, the sources also show that European powers, actually, Latin Christian powers, were the ones wishing for military aid from Ethiopia in the face of Mamluk and Ottoman threat against Latin Europe, and because Ethiopia was identified with the land of the mythical Prester John, a military powerful Christian ruler. Mamluk writers in Egypt, meanwhile, viewed the Solomonic embassies through an understandably suspicious lens, but Latin hopes and Mamluk fears do not make Ethiopian interests. In the 15th and even in the early 16th centuries, Ethiopian rulers were primarily interested in acquiring building-related labor. We also find an interest in relics and, crucially, foreign religious material culture, fine fabrics, liturgical objects, which again fits in rather well with the local history of Ethiopia in the 15th and early 16th century. Acquiring artisans and ecclesiastical wares from faraway places would have necessarily increased their local prestige, following a mechanism well attested for numerous societies in the pre-modern world. But there's also a very interesting, specifically Ethiopic Solomonic aspect to be found here. The very process of approaching a foreign court to ask for artisans and builders would have emulated actions ascribed to the biblical King Solomon, propagated by the Solomonic Ethiopian rulers as the dynasty's genealogical ancestor in their foundational myth of the Kipling Agust. It could well be that the sending of missions to Latin Christian courts would have locally asserted the Solomonic claim of rightful Solomonic descendants. Centering Ethiopian agency and reading Ethiopian diplomacy with the West as motivated by aesthetic and dynastic, rather than militaristic acquisitiveness, would moreover give us a new framework for which to understand the concurrent material culture of the Christian kingdom. Here, imported and even specifically commissioned religious objects from Europe are well attested in royal hands in the late 15th and early 16th century. To conclude, including Ethiopia within the field of medieval studies enables us to upset its underlying epistemological, as a German, this is a very complicated word, epistemological construct, which, as a product of 19th century Western academe, has long centered Latin Christianity and Latin Christian agency and ideas. But Latin Christian medieval ideas and hopes should not, must not be copy-pasted onto non-European realms such as the Solomonic Ethiopian kingdom. Incorporating Ethiopia into our academic and mental geographical and epistemological map of the Eurasian Middle Ages lets us not just uncover much about the history of Northeast Africa. We might also just be forced to reassess long-held convictions about medieval studies as a whole. Thank you very much.